So here it is, the definitive answer to the question, who shot down the first enemy aircraft in a Spit?
Now it's important to make the distinction enemy aircraft, because the answer to the question, who shot down the first aeroplane in the Spitfire, is a little different.
Ultimately, our answer really comes down to a couple of squadrons, a solicitor, fruit farmer and a bet, a 10 to 15 minute window of time and 3 shot up Junkers, all on an October afternoon in 1939. In fact, it's a really good whodunit, with different groups still championing their own candidates for the honour of being the first Brill-Boy to give the enemy a bloody nose. Though not the first German aircraft shot down by a British aircraft, nor the first technically shot down on land, a Spitfire pilot did claim the first enemy aircraft over the British Isles. So what happened exactly? In the early afternoon of the 16th of October 1939, the Scottish capital and the surrounding communities of the Firth of Forth were witness to the first Luftwaffe raid over Britain. Despite air activity having been high during the preceding days and that very morning, everyone was totally taken by surprise. Lasting less than an hour, and for some consisting of a short 10 to 20 second sighting, the impact on the memory was lasting. During that afternoon, British ships in the Firth of Forth were attacked by 12 never-seen-before German aircraft. Much to the surprise and anger of the Navy, these raiders managed to penetrate Scottish defences, sidestepping the efforts of the Air Force. By the end of the day, 4 German aircraft had been claimed by the British and 2 RAF fighters by the Luftwaffe. In reality, just 2 of the raiders were shot down by Spitfires, a third crash landing in Germany, with nothing more than a few holes entering the British aircraft. The Navy suffered the most, with 35 casualties across 3 ships, which themselves suffered no lasting damage. This was far from the aim that Germany had when they launched the raid that morning. The Luftwaffe had failed to attack its main target, HMS Hood, not because she wasn't present at the scene, but because of a personal order from the Führer himself. The Battle of the Firth of Forth, as it later became known, can be seen as a net British victory. It also had huge propaganda value, then and even today. While the Germans involved were almost all veterans of the Condor Legion, the Spitfire pilots who met them could be described as weekend enthusiasts. Indeed, some of them had only converted to the new fighter the month before.
Looking back now, you might get away with saying that this is a perfect example of the young, plucky, yet amateur Englishman duelling with and beating the Teutonic professional enemy. The only problem with that is that this squadron was largely manned by local Scots.
What's interesting, and indeed what was remarked upon at the time, was that the first German to fall to the RAF was not shot down by a regular, nor a volunteer reserve pilot. It was the auxiliary air force that claimed first blood. With a healthy rivalry with the rest of the service, this must have done wonders for the morale. The 2 squadrons in question were 603 City of Edinburgh, flying out of RAF Townhouse, and 602 City of Glasgow, relocated to RAF Drem days before the raid. They faced 4 waves of Junkers Ju-88s from 1st Staffel KG-30, led by Hauptmann Helmut Pohler and his deputy Oberleutnant Sigmund Strolp. Both men would be POWs by the end of the day, each escaping a near watery grave in the Forth. The question that confused contemporaries and took until March 1943 to receive an official decision was, who shot down which man and who fell first? The 2 names most closely related to this encounter are Flight Lieutenant Grumpy Pinkerton of 602 Squadron and Flight Lieutenant Patsy Gifford of 603 Squadron. Flying Officer Archie McKellar, Pinkerton's number 2, gets less press. In reality, the success the RAF saw was largely due to a team effort by both squadrons, made possible mostly down to the ineffective gun harmonisation each Spitfire was subjected to.
Had it not been for this last point, this entire discussion might have been concluded earlier in the day by one of the men, even before the others got airborne.
1 Staffel KG-30 took off from their base on the Isle of Silt at noon, having received intelligence from Heikel 111 from KG-26 returning across the North Sea. Recon flights had been sent out that morning to continue the chase of the battlecruiser HMS Hood, which had been sighted days before.
There's actually a lot of events to this day that I won't be covering in this video, but if you'd like a full analysis of the Battle of the Firth of Forth, please let me know in the comments and I'll definitely make that video for you.
The Heinkel reported that conditions were good over the Firth of Forth, at least for their purposes, and that the British ship had indeed been sighted. So too had Spitfires, which had attacked and so very nearly downed the aircraft. In fact, this had been Flight Lieutenant Pinkerton and his section, who were the first RAF aircraft to engage the enemy during the Second World War, but as he noted in his diary, they were unsuccessful. The presence of Spitfires in Scotland must have been of concern for Polar and his crews. For one thing, the German Chief of Intelligence, Major Beppo Schmid, had confidently told Polar, personally days before, "There's no fear of our bombers running into British fighters up there." This seems remarkable given the fact that successful German photo reconnaissance had been carried out over RAF bases along the Firth of Forth that week. Another cause for concern, this raid would be unescorted, relying entirely on surprise and a lucky escape back across the North Sea. In short order, this part of Scotland would become known as Suicide Corner by the German crews. Arriving over the target at around 14:30 hours, it almost looked as if Polar would get away with it. Indeed, he probably would have done, had he not been both incredibly brave as well as reckless. The Ju-88s would attack in waves of 3 aircraft, each wave arriving at slightly different times and subject to the navigational prowess of their individual leaders. The plan was to transit across the Scottish countryside and arrive to the west of the target area before launching the attack. Although this would result in the Ju-88s attacking into wind, thus slowing their ground speed, it would also put the sun to their backs and a clear exit route towards the open sea.
But Polar messed up.
Rather than crossing the Scottish coast around Berwick upon Tweed as Oberleutnant Strope did, Polar hit Dunbar and then flew along the southern coast of the Firth of Forth. This took him over RAF Drem and the suburbs of Edinburgh itself. Amazingly, Polar and his 2 wingmen managed to arrive over the Forth Bridge without being intercepted.
Where was the RAF?
Despite power supply issues to one local RDF station, RAF Fighter Command were more than aware of the growing threat. Both 602 and 603 squadrons were airborne and looking for enemy contacts. However, at the time it was one of the busiest pieces of sky in Britain. Many near-fatal incidents of friendly fire were amazingly avoided in the chaos and absence of IFF equipment. Aircraft recognition in this new war was still in its infancy. Meanwhile, KG-30 began their attacks. Looking into the distance, Polar finally saw the ship he had travelled nearly 500 miles to destroy, a perfect sitting duck in the docks at Rosyth. With minimal air defences, the Germans could have simply knocked this important vessel out of action for months, if not for the war. Yet, with the Führer's order delivered by telephone that morning by Jesenek himself, Polar knew he could not attack. Civilian casualties were an almost certainty. Following the compelling plea from the American President, Franklin Roosevelt, France and the UK had committed themselves to not attacking any land-based German targets. The fear was that civilians would be caught up in the bombing, and this was to be avoided at all costs. After pounding Polish towns to dust, Germany later also agreed to the arrangement. This later acquiesce to political pressure would have a direct impact on this Spitfire's first combat with the enemy. Therefore, the Luftwaffe's gaze fell on the Royal Navy and its bases of operations, then largely in faraway Scotland. This being said, it was the Royal Air Force that was to launch the first attack. More on this in another video I made, linked above. So, not allowed to target HMS Hood, instead Polar launched an attack on HMS Southampton, a legitimate naval target in the estuary. It was a tricky manoeuvre to pull off. Not only had Polar mishandled his approach by arriving from the east, there was also the tall Forth Bridge to avoid during the pullout. Amazingly, trains would be driven across the bridge throughout the air raid, slowing down and allowing the passengers a grandstand view of the proceedings. However, HMS Southampton was only hit by a single bomb, a dud, that ended up going through the side of the ship and only sinking the Admiral's personal boat, moored just where the bomb emerged. Hauptmann Polar, instead of heading directly back along the Firth of Forth, as his wingmen did, began to circle the target. This act of bravery ensured that the following waves would immediately identify the new targets, but it also significantly increased his chances of meeting the enemy. Let's not forget that 9 out of the 12 raiders pulled off a near perfect attack without a scratch. Just about when the first wave arrived over the target, the second wave, led by Oberleutnant Strope, flew across the nose of 603 Squadron's yellow section. Strope had made a better route across the North Sea and crossed the coast as planned at Berwick-upon-Tweed. This meant that upon approaching the target to the south of Edinburgh, he had to make his final turn northeast over the Threepmuir Reservoir. Just as he arrived at this landmark, yellow section were taking off from RAF Turnhouse, itself west of Edinburgh and south of the Forth Bridge. Flight Lieutenant Denholm spotted him and gave chase. Meanwhile, Red Section and 603 Squadron, led by Flight Lieutenant Gifford, and Blue Section of 602 Squadron, led by Flight Lieutenant Pinkerton, were also airborne, the former taking off mere minutes before. Having circled the British ships below for what must have been a good quarter of an hour, Hauptmann Polar made good his escape, picking his way east through clouds. However, he was not alone. Blue Section, 602 Squadron, had flown north towards the Forth Bridge after hearing about the attack. They did not immediately sight the enemy, instead nearly shooting down a flight of Navy sea skewers. Then Flying Officer McKellar saw a lone Ju-88 through the cloud. Blue Section gave chase, but lost Blue 3, Flying Officer Webb, in the same cloud. So Pinkerton and McKellar pursued the enemy along the north coast of the Forth, firing whenever he popped out of cloud. It was Polar. Soon, in order to keep his course east, Polar was forced to break into open sky, and soon came under fire from McKellar and in particular Pinkerton, who got in the final burst. Heavily damaged, Polar crashed into the sea off the Isle of May. A shore observer noted the time as 14:55, while Pinkerton later stated in his combat report the attack was delivered at 1500 hours. But Hauptmann Polar was not the first Ju-88 shot down that day. Having crossed paths with Yellow Section over the reservoir, Strope and his wingmen broke up their formation, as did the Spitfires. Turning northeast, Strope flew low over Edinburgh, pursued by Pilot Officer Morton, not the 12 Spitfires he claimed later. However, the British fighters were keen not to open fire over the city, and it wasn't until they were clear that Pilot Officer Morton closed in and got the Ju-88's engines smoking over Wallyford. Aboard the German aircraft, Strope later reported that the gunner was dead, and he knew he was done for. He flew towards the water, hoping to deny the British an intact example of the new bomber. That should have decided the matter. This is when Red Section arrived. Flight Lieutenant Gifford, first flying close to positively identify the aircraft as an enemy, opened fire. He then made way for another Spitfire, probably Flying Officer Morton, who gave the Ju-88 another burst, emptying his guns and turning for home. At this point the fight was over Port Seaton, where Flight Lieutenant Gifford delivered the coup de grace. Upon this last burst, Strope flopped into the chilly waters of the Forth. The time given was 14:45. Strope was rescued, along with 2 other crew members, by the fishing crew of Day Spring. So relieved to have been dragged from the water, Strope presented the skipper, John Dixon, with his gold signet ring as a souvenir. It remains in the family to this day. While numbers 602 and 603 were praised by both Air Vice Marshal Sewell and Dowding for having drawn first blood, it is Flight Lieutenant Gifford and Flight Lieutenant Pinkerton who are usually singled out as the victors. In reality, it was a team effort. In all likelihood, had 603's Red Section not arrived over Wallyford and joined Pilot Officer Morton, Strope's Ju-88 would probably have crashed anyway. Nevertheless, the modest Gifford, a solicitor mere weeks before, was able to win his bet. Flight Lieutenant Gifford had indeed officially downed the first EA for the squadron, and as it turned out, for the RAF as a whole. Gifford would make a further 2 claims that month before joining No. 3 Squadron as its new CO on the 19th of November 1939. This involved him converting to the Hurricane. 10 days later, his own DFC came through for these actions over the Firth of Forth. 7 months to the day of his legendary feat, the 16th of May, squadron leader Gifford was shot down by Me-110s over France. He was 30 years old. Flight Lieutenant Pinkerton, who was still a fruit farmer weeks before this action, was also awarded the DFC and returned to his farm after the war.
But what about the other Ju-88, the one that crash landed in Germany?
Pilot Officer Robertson, who had joined Flight Lieutenant Gifford in downing the first German aircraft over Britain, joined forces with Pilot Officer Morton, taking off again at 1540 and 1600 hours respectively, to intercept another raider low over Rosyth. They chased this raider out to sea with a stationary starboard engine. Given the level of damage and the clearly labelled crash landing, it seems the most likely candidate for the third Ju-88 lost that day.
But of course, this was not the first aircraft ever shot down by a Spitfire. It was the second. The first was a Hurricane, one shot down by Flying Officer Breen and Pilot Officer Freeborn. These blokes were pretty much hung out to dry by their leader, Sailor Malan. More on this in a video on screen now. But as I haven't actually recorded that video yet, here's an equally interesting one on screen now.